Welcome to Urban Book Club. Today, I'm proud to introduce Brian Price, who's worked with major studios, TV networks, and independent film producers from around the world. Brian has taught at Yale and Johns Hopkins Universities, as well as the Brooks Institute. He sits on the faculty at UCLA Film and Television Screenwriting and is the author of Classical Storytelling and Contemporary Screenwriting, Aristotle and the Modern Storyteller, just released from Focal Press. Brian, take it away and ask him anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm looking forward to answering everybody's questions. Let's do it.
Hey, Brian. So my idea of classical storytelling is one that is built upon lies, remission, and oppression. So, because classical storytelling is all about teaching somebody a way to be that fits the mainstream people versus what might be norm or best needed. So my question is, how do you teach this and still encourage people to tell their truths and to while fitting inside of a structure that's very boxy. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. While I completely appreciate your take on the subject, I have to disagree that classical storytelling is by nature built upon lies and remission. Certainly stories can be oppressive. They can certainly toe the status quo. But what Aristotle was getting at in the Poetics was that if you look at the stories that resonate universally, that have stood the test of time, we can see certain recurring patterns and elements and principles that if we're smart, we can make use of in our own stories so that they can have that universal appeal, so that they can touch whatever is fundamental about all of us as human beings. I wanted to add one other thing quickly because I think you really nailed it on the head when you talked about personal truths. A good story has the one essential ingredient of expressing the artist's personal truth. That is a requirement of a good story well told. But even while expressing that personal truth, it is essential that one at least acknowledge that in the stories that have stood the test of time, regardless of culture, regardless of history or geography, there are certain recurring patterns, elements, and principles that tells us that not only as human beings do we have this need to tell stories, but we seem to have a need to tell them in a particular way. And that's what my book is actually all about. Thanks for the question, Cameron. Unfortunately, there is no 7 neon hues of character. That was just something I made up. Thanks for reading the first page of the chapter. If you read the rest of it, you see I'm actually making fun of the fact that there are so many screenwriters and screenwriting teachers out there who've tried to reduce the craft of screenwriting down to some simple formula or a simple color scheme or shape. And the truth is you can't. But the truth is also, if there's a system that works for you, that speaks to you, that helps you organically develop your characters, use it. Oh, Sierra, thanks for the question. Unfortunately, there is no story-generating trapezoid. As I answered in another question, that was just something that I made up, making fun of the fact that there are so many books out there that try to reduce creating a story down to some simple formula. There is no simple formula. But that said, if you want to truly understand the observable patterns and the recurring elements that show up in story after story in the successful stories, you need to read Aristotle's Poetics. He nails it. Elise, that is an excellent question. I have a lot of students who bristle at the whole concept of structure, thinking that that's going to make a cookie-cutter movie. But the truth is, if you look at your parking lot, you see a lot of different cars, a Porsche, an SUV, a motorcycle. None of them look the same. You're not going to confuse one for the other, but they all have round wheels. Why? Because round wheels work. There's no point in making a car, a vehicle with triangular wheels. And that's structure. It works. But no two stories are going to look the same because you've stuck to the traditional structure. Elise, I just wanted to add one more thing about structure. When you're writing a story, you need to know structure. You need to know the 3 acts, the beginning, middle, and an end, the setup, the complications, the resolution. But it doesn't mean you can't play around with it. You can't subvert it. Of course you can. There's some great movies that subvert structure. But what you need to know as a writer is that it has consequences. Because an audience, whether they know structure or not, is coming to your movie with certain expectations. And if those expectations aren't met, it's going to affect the experience. So be aware of those consequences. Interesting question, Cecilia. I don't think we're ever going to reach any kind of saturation in storytelling, and that's because, as Aristotle observes, as long as there have been human beings on this planet, there's been storytelling, because it's one of the things that connects all human beings, regardless of culture or geography or history, and it's what separates us from the other animals on this planet, because there's something built into our DNA that requires us to tell stories. It performs a necessary function, one that I describe at length in my book. You should read it. So no, as long as there are human beings on this planet, there's always going to be storytellings. As far as genres, they come and go. It's cyclical. If it goes away for a while, we'll be interested in it again soon. Isabel, I would say that every storytelling medium requires structure equally. The structure in a joke, in a novel, in a short story, in a TV show, in a movie is still the same. Setup, complications, resolution. A screwdriver walks into a bar. The bartender says, "Hey, we've got a drink named after you." The screwdriver says, "Really? You got a drink named Melvin?" Setup, complications, resolution. It's in each individual episode of a TV show. It's within the entire arc of a good television series. Good question, Margaret. I would say Aristotle was just one smart cookie. What he was doing when he was writing the Poetics, of course, was looking at all the dramatic narratives that existed during his time and prior, and looking at what are the recurring elements and the patterns that we see over and over again, and what conclusions can we draw from the stories that have those principles versus the ones that don't. And the things that he discovered are just as relevant today with the latest Star Wars movie as it was in his day with the latest Oedipus Rex story. Oh, Drew, any screenwriter will tell you that a movie is never more perfect than it is when they turned in that final draft. But the truth is, a movie is a very collaborative process. And while the screenwriter might have created that initial story and be responsible for everybody else's employment on that movie set, everybody else on that movie set has a role to play. The director, the lighting people, the cinematographer, the special effects, the music, and yes, the editing. A movie is never completed until it actually shows up there on the screen. So I would say all that work isn't necessarily improving the creativity, but I would say all that work is absolutely necessary to the final product. Thanks for the question, Alexandria. I wouldn't say it's either good nor bad. It depends on the movie and the movie makers. If you're making a movie that was written by Aaron Sorkin, you better stick to that dialogue. If you're making a Christopher Guest movie, there probably isn't any written dialogue, and it's all going to be improvised. So it really depends on the specific circumstance. Great question, Nolan. And the connections between stories and mythologies of different cultures is really well described and analyzed in the works of Joseph Campbell and Christopher Vogler. If you haven't read them, definitely check it out. But what it all comes down to is Aristotle's observation that storytelling exists in every culture for a reason. It's one of the things that connects all human beings and that separates us from the other animals on this planet. And it comes down to the fact that, unique among all the animals on the planet, we have a need to ask questions. We have a desire to learn. We have a joy in learning. And ultimately, that's storytelling's function. Nice question, Macy. Sure, some stories push a morality lesson or try to reinforce cultural norms. But in general, the function of storytelling is what Aristotle calls mimesis, representation, imitation. The idea of having our world and our universe reflected back to us so we can look at that story, look at that movie on the screen and say, I recognize that. I understand that. That is me. Because that's how we learn. That's how we advance as individuals and as a culture and as a society, by seeing our world reflected back to us. And ultimately, that is the function of a good story. I love this question. The relationship between storytelling and religion is basically that both serve the identical function, which is to try to explain the existential questions that all human beings face. Why are we here? What is my place in the universe? What is my purpose? That's what religion is trying to explain. And the best stories are asking those questions so that, again, we can have the joy in learning through the experience of feeling. Tori, I think that comedians' role is to exaggerate, to push things to their natural conclusion, to make fun of them. Whereas movies and a good story in general is about holding up the mirror to nature, as it were, as Shakespeare would say. So for that reason, I would say the best stories would not perpetuate stereotypes, because then they wouldn't be authentic. And the best stories should show us a world that we recognize and that we can identify with, because again, that's how we learn and how we grow, and that is the function of a good story. If you go to WGA.org, the Writers Guild website, there's a list of what they consider the 101 greatest screenplays. If you're asking me what are the modern classic scripts, I would have to say Casablanca, Some Like It Hot, A Few Good Men, Sunshine for the Spotless Mind, The Godfather, and right now I'm really, really impressed with the screenplay for Get Out. While it is the writer's job to tell the truth, their own personal truth as they know it, to capture the words and the images and actions on the page and then on the screen that reveals the world and human experience and human emotion as they know it, a screenwriter should also be aware that their words and their choices have consequences, that what they say or reveal may insult, may offend. And I think as long as the writer knows that those consequences exist, they should be free to tell their truth. I'm not sure Alexander the Great learned anything from Plato, but he certainly learned a lot from Aristotle, who was Plato's pupil. Aristotle, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, who wrote books and treatises on just about every subject under the sun, I'm sure taught Alexander all the things that he himself had written about. He taught Alexander languages, Hebrew, Babylonian, Latin. He taught him science and astronomy and biology. He taught him rhetoric and justice. And as a teacher myself, I would say what Alexander did with that knowledge, well, you can't blame the teacher. Love this question, Donald. Voiceover is one of those things that screenwriting teachers will tell their students to avoid at all costs. Because usually a voiceover, like your question intimates, is just a way to patch things up, to provide expositional information that the writer wasn't able to more cleverly reveal in the emotional present of the story. But there are a lot of movies and a lot of genres like film noir, like literary adaptations, like documentaries, in which we need that narrative voice. So it is required. So it really depends on the movie, whether or not it's important or a patch. Of all the movie scripts that were nominated for Best Screenplay this year, the one that I'm the biggest fan of is Get Out. And the reason has to do with, as an audience member, I just so enjoyed the experience of watching that movie. But as a screenwriter, I just so appreciated it, because ultimately we go to movies to have an emotional experience, to laugh, to cry, to scream. And that movie provided the whole gamut of emotion. So to me, that was my favorite screenplay. I would say the only closure that's required in a good story is that you answer the dramatic question that was set up at the beginning. Will she make partner? Will he get the girl? Will they find the treasure? Will they commit the crime? Will they solve the crime? That's the question that you pose at the beginning, and that's the question that needs to be answered at the end, and that's what gives a story closure. As far as giving a resolution to all the characters. Not everything needs to be tied up with a neat bow, but I think we do need to see what is the new equilibrium for the principal characters. What is their life like now that they've gone through everything they went through in the story? If another screenwriter uses Memento-like storytelling in their story, obviously they're going to be accused of ripping off Memento. The truth is that audiences come to movies with certain expectations, even if they're not conscious of them, that things are going to be told in a particular way, with a particular emphasis happening in a particular place in the story. That's what good structure is. And movies that play with that structure, Pulp Fiction, The Usual Suspects, Memento, do so successfully when the subject matter is appropriate to something unconventional. Otherwise, it's just going to fall flat. Hi, Emily. I think that you're talking about TV versus film here, and we're certainly in a golden age, a renaissance of television, particularly serialized television, which is not short form. It is very long form because we have to watch the 10 episodes or more to get the entirety of the story if we're watching something on Netflix or Hulu. But I think that there will always be a place for movies. That 2-hour experience in the dark, leaving your house, being in a room with dozens of other people, there's nothing that can match that just sitting on your couch. So there'll always be movies. I have to agree with Aristotle when he says that the most important element of any dramatic narrative is the story. It comes first. Because the truth is, you can be deficient in any other area, in your characterization, in your lighting, in the costumes, and it can still be a pleasurable experience. But if you have a bad story, no other element can save it. So story is the most important, and that's what's got to come first. I always start my third screenwriting class by asking all the students to name a movie that made them cry. And if one of the writers says, I've never cried at a movie, I know I'm going to have trouble with them. Because that's why we go to movies, to have an emotional experience. We don't go to learn something, we go to feel something, whether that's to laugh or to cry or to scream. If a movie can elicit emotions from us, it's a good movie. If it leaves us feeling cold, it's not. That's as simple as that. I'm not sure, Abby, I agree with your premise. Aristotle absolutely thought music was important in storytelling. It's one of the 6 essential elements, along with story, character, thought, diction, and spectacle. He has song. But of course, music in his time meant something different than us. He wasn't talking about a soundtrack because there were no movies. He was talking about tragedies on a stage. And when he talked about song, it was because a lot of the dialogue, especially from the chorus, was sung. But it was absolutely essential. And music is absolutely essential today to create the emotional experience that a movie requires. Oh my goodness, I have a confession to make. I've never read anything by George R.R. Martin, and I've never read anything by J.K. Rowling, so I can't tell you which one of them is the greatest storyteller alive. But I can tell you this, I love the Game of Thrones. I've watched every episode. I will watch every episode. So if I had to flip a coin, I'm going to give it to the guy with the beard. Honestly, as an actor, I've been a fan of Mel Gibson. As a director, I've been a fan of Mel Gibson. I've never read, actually, one of his screenplays, Apocalypto or The Passion of the Christ. But I, unfortunately, am not a huge fan of either of those two movies. So I guess in answer to your question, am I a fan of Mel Gibson's writing? I'd have to say, meh. Jake, that's probably the most awesome question of all. Is screenwriting a serious biz? It's certainly a difficult biz. It's certainly a biz that a lot of people aspire to be a part of. Economically, it's certainly a serious biz. The economics of the film industry are huge, and screenwriting is essential to that business. But I would say even more than that. Storytelling is essential to the human experience. We have to tell stories. And screenwriting is simply the most modern, contemporary, ubiquitous form of that craft. And so, yes, it is essential. Is poetry dead? Not by a long shot. I love this quote from William Wordsworth. He says, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. As long as human beings feel and have a need to express those feelings, there will be poetry. The cathartic expression of one's inner life is essential to good living." So I would say, as long as they're human beings, there's going to be poetry.
What's the difference between a screenplay and a book?
Great question, sir. I got to say, you look very familiar to me. The big difference between a screenplay and a book is that a book is an end of itself. A screenplay, on the other hand, is a work of art intended for another medium entirely, the production of a movie. The other big difference would be that in a screenplay, you're limited entirely to describing what we can see and what we can hear, description and dialogue. You have to be able to use those elements to get inside a character's head, which you have much more freedom to do in a book.
Brian, thank you. Now, your answers are so clear and precise, I have one more question for you. Your book, Classical Storytelling and Contemporary Screenwriting, it covers the genesis and the evolution of storytelling and the common thread that weaves itself through the fabric of storytelling and the similarities that exist. But tell us how your book will help someone that's toying with the idea of starting a screenplay, reworking a screenplay, or trying to make an existing screenplay better in order to be the next big thing, the next movie. Thank you very much, Brian.
Josh, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, the basic premise of my book is that there's a right way to tell a story. That Aristotle, in his Poetics, identified those recurring elements and principles that existed in the successful stories of his time. And that if we acknowledge the truth that screenwriting is part of that continuum of storytelling, just the most modern way in which we tell stories, then we have to accept that we can utilize those principles to make our screenplays better. So ultimately, this book is about how to write a screenplay the way the pros do it, using those important principles.
Brian, real quick before you go, can you please tell us what your favorite screenplay is from each genre? Thank you so much if you have time to answer. Your time is so appreciated.
Sure, Josh, I can answer that. Of course, it changes probably from day to day. But my favorite comedy script is A Fish Called Wanda. My favorite horror script is Dawn of the Dead. My favorite action film script is Long Kiss Goodnight. My favorite romance script is Titanic. My favorite drama is Casablanca. My favorite Western script is Unforgiven. And I would say my favorite musical script is probably Singing in the Rain. If I missed a genre, apologies. Of course, as soon as I submitted that response, a dozen more screenplays came to mind. So let me toss a few more out there, independent of genre. The Godfather, Some Like It Hot, Goodfellas, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Groundhog Day, Psycho, Harold and Maude, Chinatown, Little Miss Sunshine, Hard Candy. These are all incredible screenplays that anyone who wants to be a screenwriter should read, learn from, and aspire to.
Hey Brian, I was wondering if you could answer a question for me. In writing a screenplay, what's the difference between a character's want versus their need, and how important is it to the story? Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. That's an excellent question, and gosh, it looks cold where you are. Knowing a character's want and a character's need is essential to writing a good story. A character's want, of course, refers to their objective, the thing that's propelling the plot forward. All stories are about a character who wants something and the obstacles that are standing in the way of getting it. A character's need, on the other hand, refers to their primary flaw, their missing piece, the thing that they're maybe not consciously aware of, but the thing that hopefully this journey they go on is going to help heal in some way. In the best stories, of course, at the end, the character doesn't get what they want. They get what they need, which means they find that healing.